The morning sunlight poured through the glass facade of Sterling Global Industries like a divine spotlight, illuminating a world where power wore tailored suits and ambition echoed in the clicking of polished shoes across marble floors. And this particular morning seemed no different, until the quiet order of the corporate kingdom fractured under the thundering fury of its young CEO, Daniel Sterling, whose voice ricocheted off walls and rattled every workstation within 10 floors. He had stormed out of his office, his face a blend of disbelief and rage, declaring that his limited edition diamond-studded Patek Philippe watch, a centerpiece of his collection and a symbol of his wealth, status, and supposed superiority, had vanished from his drawer, sending his assistants scrambling like frightened birds and prompting a full-scale internal uproar. As Daniel barked orders at anyone within reach, demanding explanations, suspects, and immediate action, because in his mind, nothing of his could ever simply be misplaced. Someone had taken it, someone with audacity and desperation, someone beneath him. His frustration escalated with every passing second, and when he reviewed the security footage and spotted only one figure near his office during the time frame, the watch could have gone missing. A frail, elderly janitor named Harold, quietly mopping the hallway floor with the gentle patience of a man who had spent a lifetime working thankless jobs. Daniel's suspicion hardened into certainty. Without waiting for a second opinion, and without bothering to check the entire footage thoroughly, he slammed his fist on the table and marched toward the lower lobby, where Harold was pushing his cleaning cart, humming softly to himself in the serene way that aging souls sometimes do, unaware of the storm about to engulf him. The moment their paths crossed, Daniel erupted, accusing the old man in a voice so loud that employees poked their heads from offices and cubicles to see what was happening. He demanded Harold empty his pockets, open his bag, surrender everything he carried, shouting that he knew a thief when he saw one, and that people like Harold, old, quiet, poor, always assumed no one was watching. The elderly janitor froze, his hands trembling in a way that betrayed not guilt, but shock, fear, and the sudden sting of humiliation. He stammered that he had taken nothing, that he would never steal, that he had children and a reputation to uphold. But Daniel cut him off with a wave of his hand, calling his pleas pathetic excuses. Employees watched with growing discomfort, some recording snippets on their phones before thinking better and putting them away, their hearts sinking as the CEO's tirade intensified. Harold's face turned pale as Daniel's words battered him, tearing at his dignity, and when security arrived at the CEO's command, they reluctantly obeyed, guiding the janitor to open his worn-out locker where nothing lay but an old lunch container, a faded photograph, and a small tattered Bible he kept for comfort during long night shifts. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. There was no watch, no stolen item, nothing even remotely suspicious. But Daniel refused to accept their findings. He insisted Harold must have hidden it somewhere else, passed it to someone, or planned to sneak it out after hours, because the idea that he, Daniel Sterling, could misplace something himself was unthinkable. Harold, with watery eyes and a cracking voice, repeated that he never touched anything in Daniel's office, but the CEO drowned his words with fresh accusations, calling him a liar, a thief, and a disgrace. As more employees gathered, whispers began circulating through the hall, some expressing disbelief, some pity, some outrage, but no one dared intervene, for fear of becoming the CEO's next verbal target. The spectacle stretched on until Daniel, satisfied with the public humiliation he had inflicted, ordered security to escort Harold out of the building until further notice, and declared he would be pressing charges once he found proof. Leaving Harold standing there, crushed, trembling, and fighting, the humiliation burning in his chest, the old man gathered what little strength he had left to whisper, "I didn't steal anything, sir." But Daniel had already turned away. Security gently guided Harold out, apologizing softly, though their words could not soothe a wound carved so deeply. As the elderly man exited the towering corporate headquarters that had employed him faithfully for years, the sky itself seemed to dim slightly, as though mourning the injustice that had unfolded within those glossy walls. And in that moment, as Harold walked down the steps with slow, defeated strides, clutching his cleaning rag like a lifeline, no one in the building, not Daniel, not the staff, not even Harold, knew that this single act of arrogance and cruelty would unravel the company's power structure, shake reputations, expose long-hidden truths, and ignite a chain of events that would leave Daniel Sterling facing consequences greater than any he'd ever imagined. For the man he had just publicly disgraced was far from the helpless nobody he believed him to be. He was someone whose importance would soon turn Daniel's world on its head. The atmosphere inside Sterling Global Industries shifted dramatically in the hours following Harold's public humiliation, as though someone had opened the door to a storm and allowed uneasy winds to curl through every corridor, every break room, every cluster of cubicles, where employees gathered in low, conflicted whispers. And while the morning had begun with the usual sense of urgency and polished professionalism that defined the corporate giant, it had quickly transformed into a hive of uneasy tension, with everyone replaying in their minds the image of the elderly janitor trembling under the weight of accusations he couldn't defend himself from, conversations that would normally revolve around deadlines, quarterly goals, or the CEO's unpredictable moods now revolved around Harold, the old man who had always walked the halls with a gentle smile, offering soft greetings to everyone from interns to directors, the same man who stayed late to clean after corporate banquets, who quietly fixed broken coffee machines, who sometimes offered fatherly advice to anxious young employees struggling with their first job, and yet had been treated like a criminal by the man who sat at the top of the corporate throne. In the executive wing, assistants exchanged stunned looks as rumors flew like sparks. Some claimed Harold had been handcuffed, which wasn't true. Some insisted they saw Daniel throw the Bible from Harold's locker across the floor, also untrue, while others said Harold fainted from shock, partially true. He had stumbled, but caught himself before he fell. But regardless of the accuracy of details, the employees all agreed on one thing: something deeply wrong had taken place that morning, something that left a stain on the company's carefully curated image of ethical leadership. The security guards, who had reluctantly obeyed the CEO's commands, stood near the surveillance room, replaying the footage over and over, guilt tightening their chests as they remembered how Harold had apologized even when he had done nothing wrong, as if decades of being overlooked had conditioned him to apologize for merely existing. One guard even wiped his eyes when no one was looking, because he had known Harold for years and couldn't believe that a man so humble, so harmless, could be accused of something as bold as stealing a CEO's diamond watch. Meanwhile, on the top floor, Daniel stormed in and out of his office with the restless energy of someone who needed to blame someone else to justify his own carelessness, barking orders for further investigation, criticizing his assistants for not catching Harold sooner, and dismissing anyone who suggested the possibility that the watch was simply misplaced. In his mind, his wealth placed him above the possibility of human error, and that mindset only fueled the arrogance that had driven him to lash out at Harold in the first place. But while Daniel fed his ego, the rest of the building fed something else entirely: doubt, discomfort, and quiet rebellion. Older employees who had been with the company since its early days began whispering among themselves, recalling moments when Harold mentioned a son he rarely saw, a son who worked in business but was always too busy to come around. One elderly accountant remembered Harold saying his son had become someone important, though he never disclosed details, choosing instead to speak with pride but also sadness when referring to him. A few long-time staff members also recalled the early years of the board chairman, Victor Wentworth, when he used to visit the building more frequently. Someone pointed out that Harold had once been seen adjusting Victor's tie before an important press conference many years ago, like a father fussing over his child. But everyone had assumed Harold was simply being friendly or paternal in nature. But now, as they pieced together small moments, overheard comments, and the strange familiarity between Harold and the chairman that they had never paid attention to before, a new rumor began to grow. Quiet but persistent, spreading with the intrigue of a well-hidden secret finally demanding to be seen. In the cafeteria, younger employees debated whether they should speak up or stay silent, torn between fear of Daniel's temper and the growing sense that Harold deserved justice. One intern confessed she wanted to report what she saw, but her supervisor warned her that doing so could cost her position, reminding her that Daniel had fired people for less. In HR, a cluster of managers reviewed the company handbook on employee rights, alarmed by how flagrantly Daniel had violated protocol. In HR, a cluster of managers reviewed the company handbook on employee rights, alarmed by how flagrantly Daniel had violated protocol, especially since the accused was elderly and held a long-standing record of loyalty. One HR manager quietly drafted an incident report, but hesitated to submit it, unsure how the board would react if it became official. Even the cleaning staff, usually invisible to the corporate world, walked through the halls with their heads down, feeling the absence of one of their own like a missing heartbeat, and some whispered prayers for Harold's safety, praying he hadn't collapsed from the stress after returning home. Meanwhile, tucked away in his private office, Daniel continued pacing like a king who believed he had been wronged, muttering angrily about ungrateful employees and good-for-nothing janitors, refusing to let go of the lie he told himself, that he was in control, that he had made the right decision, that his reputation was untouchable. But what Daniel didn't know, what no one in the building yet understood, was that the board chairman had been notified of the commotion. A receptionist had nervously mentioned the incident to his secretary, unaware of its significance, and within minutes the news had reached Victor Wentworth, who had listened to every word with a growing expression of horror and fury. And while employees continued whispering theories and fears, wondering if Harold would ever be allowed back, or if the truth about the watch would ever come out. Something far bigger and far more explosive began moving beneath the surface, because Victor wasn't just disturbed by the CEO's behavior, he was devastated, enraged, and preparing to expose a truth that would strike the company harder than any scandal before it. As the day progressed, the whispers grew louder, the tension thickened, and invisible lines began forming. Those who sided with justice and those who valued self-preservation, unaware that before the sun set again, the entire building would witness a confrontation that would shake its foundations and reveal that the fragile, elderly janitor everyone pitied was not just a man wronged, but a man whose identity would flip the power dynamics of the entire corporation upside down. The next morning, long before most employees arrived, the atmosphere inside Sterling Global Industries felt strangely heavy, as if the walls themselves anticipated a reckoning, and the tension only escalated when a sleek black limousine pulled up to the company's private entrance, its tinted windows reflecting the early sun like dark, watchful eyes. The driver stepped out with practiced precision and opened the rear door to reveal Victor Wentworth, the board chairman whose name alone could silence an entire room, a man known for his unshakable composure, strategic brilliance, and quiet authority, a man few employees ever encountered directly, yet whose influence permeated every inch of the corporate empire. Victor rarely visited the headquarters unannounced, so his sudden appearance sent a ripple of shock and speculation through the building, and employees scrambled to straighten their ties, adjust their skirts, and fix their postures, instinctively preparing themselves for scrutiny from a man who missed nothing. But Victor wasn't paying attention to them this time. He stepped inside with a stiff, tense stride and a faint tremble in his hand, the kind that only surfaces in moments of deep emotional disturbance. He glanced around the lobby, expecting to see a familiar figure, one he had grown accustomed to greeting quietly over the years. A soft smile, a respectful nod, a humble, "Good morning, sir," uttered with sincerity rather than fear, because Harold, unlike everyone else, had never been intimidated by Victor's title. He treated him like a fellow human being rather than a towering figure of corporate dominance. But Harold wasn't there. His absence hit Victor instantly, like a cold blade sliding between his ribs. He approached the front desk, his voice steady, but edged with a subtle urgency as he asked, "Where is Harold today?" The receptionist froze, her smile faltering as panic fluttered beneath her expression. No one wanted to be the bearer of bad news to a man like Victor, but after a hesitant breath, she told him the truth. The CEO had accused Harold of stealing a diamond watch, publicly humiliated him, searched his belongings in front of staff, and ordered him out of the building. Each word struck Victor harder than the last. For a moment he didn't speak. He simply stared at the receptionist with a silent intensity, and then turned away, jaw clenched, shoulders tight, as his carefully guarded composure cracked at the edges. He demanded to see the security footage. He watched the confrontation in full, Daniel's booming accusations, the crowd gathering, Harold's trembling hands, the forced locker search, the security escort, and every frame deepened the fury in Victor's chest, a fury rooted not in corporate embarrassment, but in something far more personal, far more painful. Because the man Daniel had humiliated wasn't just an employee. He wasn't just a janitor. He wasn't just someone Victor respected. He was Victor's father, The revelation that had remained quietly hidden for decades now seethed beneath Victor's skin, threatening to erupt as he replayed the footage, gripping the desk with white-knuckled force. Harold had begged him years ago not to reveal their relationship, not to treat him differently, not to risk accusations of favoritism or nepotism. He had insisted on earning his place with dignity, with hard work, with humility, even if it meant cleaning the floors in the shadows, while his son sat in boardrooms, steering the company toward international prestige. And Victor had honored that request until now, because what he saw on the screen wasn't simply a violation of company protocol, it was a violation of his father's dignity, his humanity, and his trust. He couldn't breathe in that moment, thinking of the years Harold spent quietly supporting him, cheering for him from afar, never asking for anything but a little time, a little love, a little acknowledgement. Memories flooded his mind. Harold teaching him how to fix watches in their tiny workshop. Harold staying late to make sure he ate when he was studying for exams. Harold hugging him tightly the day he was accepted into business school. Harold sitting in the audience at his graduation with tears in his eyes. But then came the memory he hated most. The day they argued when Victor was younger, arrogant, and rising too quickly, the day he told his father he wanted distance from their humble life. The day he walked away and left Harold alone with a heart full of quiet heartbreak. Watching the footage now, seeing his father humiliated, helpless, accused of theft, Victor felt a crushing wave of regret. How many moments had he wasted? How many years had been lost? He closed his eyes and drew a long, trembling breath before standing abruptly and commanding his driver to prepare the car again. "Find him," he ordered, his voice rougher than his secretary had ever heard. "Find Harold Wentworth immediately." Employees watched from afar as the chairman strode through the lobby like a storm wrapped in a suit, his expression carved from steel, his presence radiating so much cold fury that even the security guards straightened instinctively. No one knew where he was going, but everyone sensed something monumental was about to unfold. As the limousine pulled away from the building, Victor pressed the security photo of Harold's locker picture in his hand, a picture of Harold and a younger Victor taken decades ago, and whispered with a voice that trembled under the weight of swallowed guilt, "I'm sorry, Father. I should never have let anyone treat you this way." And with that vow hanging in the air, the car sped through the city, streets toward the small, humble apartment where Harold lived, unaware that the truth he'd hidden for years was about to erupt into the open and shake the corporate world to its core. Harold lived in a tiny, aging apartment on the quiet edge of the city, a place that bore the soft imprint of a life lived with humility rather than wealth. Its worn carpet, yellowed curtains, and shelves filled with decades of memories, telling a story far deeper than any resume could. And when Victor arrived at the building, far too luxurious a car for the neighborhood, it drew curious stares from elderly residents sitting on the steps and children playing in the cracked courtyard. But Victor didn't notice any of them. He moved as if driven by something heavier than urgency, something closer to heartbreak, climbing the narrow staircase 2 steps at a time until he reached the faded door. He had not stood before in far too many years. For a moment he hesitated, his hand hovering just short of the wood, the weight of regret pinning him in place as memories flooded him. His father bent over a workbench, repairing broken watches with delicate precision. His father walking him to school with lunch, packed in an old metal tin. His father staying up late to help him study. And worst of all, his father standing silent and wounded the day Victor declared he needed distance from small life, small dreams, small beginnings, the words he wished he could rip out of existence. When he finally knocked, it was soft at first, then stronger when there was no response. And after a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing Harold standing there in a faded sweater, his shoulders slumped, eyes puffy from a night spent battling humiliation and sorrow. For a second, he didn't recognize the man before him, but as soon as the light hit Victor's face, his breath caught and his knees nearly buckled. "Victor," he whispered, his voice breaking under disbelief. And before he could say anything else, his son stepped forward and embraced him, with a desperation that stunned them both. Harold trembled in Victor's arms, overwhelmed by emotions he thought he had buried. Joy, shock, sorrow, fear, all tangled together. As they sat inside the small apartment, the silence be. In the bustling headquarters of Sterling Global Industries, the young, sharp-tongued CEO, Daniel Sterling, stormed through the lobby, his voice echoing like an impending storm, as he noticed his limited edition diamond Patek Philippe missing from his office drawer, a watch worth more than most employees earned in 2 years. And after checking the security feeds and finding nothing suspicious except the quiet presence of Mr. Harold, the elderly janitor wiping the hallway floor near his office, Daniel snapped, convinced he had uncovered the culprit. He marched downstairs, where Harold was gathering trash bags, confronted him in front of employees and security staff, and accused him of the theft. His voice filled with venom as he demanded that the janitor empty his pockets and open his locker, while Harold's trembling hands and pale face showed both humiliation and shock as he barely managed to whisper that he hadn't taken anything. But Daniel, driven by arrogance and his belief that poor people always take what doesn't belong to them, insisted he must be guilty, triggering a scene so public, so cruel, and so unjust that whispers rushed through the building like wildfire as employees watched the elderly man's dignity crumble under the weight of an accusation he couldn't defend himself from. And as Harold stood there, shivering, not from guilt, but from deep heartbreak, Daniel ordered security to escort him out of the building, promising legal charges, unaware that this moment of blind rage would soon ricochet back at him, with consequences powerful enough to shake the entire company and alter his life forever. The humiliation of the elderly janitor became the day's biggest conversation as employees gathered in corners, cafeterias, and chat groups, questioning why the CEO would publicly shame a man known for his kindness, punctuality, and gentle nature, a man who had worked tirelessly for years without complaint. And while some employees feared speaking out against Daniel's actions, many felt a growing sense of discomfort and guilt for witnessing Harold's disgrace. Meanwhile, the security guards, who had been ordered to search the janitor's belongings, felt uneasy as they found no trace of the missing watch, nothing even remotely suspicious, just a neatly folded lunch bag, a family photograph of Harold with a younger man whose face was partly turned, unrecognizable at first glance, and an old pocket Bible worn at the edges. And as they reported to Daniel that nothing was found, his impatience and ego pushed him to dismiss their findings, claiming the old man must have hidden it somewhere else or passed it to someone, insisting he knew a thief when he saw one, as he stormed back to his office. And yet, beneath all the noise and gossip, a smaller rumor began forming among the older staff, those who had been in the company since its early days, because some of them remembered that Harold had once spoken about a son he rarely saw, a son who worked in business but was too busy to visit. And while no one thought much of it before, something about the picture in his locker and the odd sense that Harold always seemed familiar to the board members sparked speculation that this scandal might not be as simple as it seemed, setting the stage for a revelation none of them were prepared for. When the board chairman, Mr. Victor Wentworth, arrived for an unscheduled visit, the entire building shifted into a tense state of alert, because Victor was a man of immense influence and few words, a silent power whose presence alone could freeze conversations. But as he stepped into the lobby, he noticed the fragile absence of someone who usually greeted him, a gentle nod, a quiet, "Good morning, sir," the soft shuffle of aging feet he had grown accustomed to. And when he asked the receptionist about Harold, her nervous expression immediately told him something was wrong. So she explained the CEO's accusation, the public shaming, the escorting out of the building, and the chairman's eyes hardened with both sorrow and fury. Without a word, he demanded the security footage, analyzing every frame until he saw the confrontation and Harold's devastated expression, which cut him deeper than anyone could have imagined. And though no one yet knew why the chairman seemed personally affected, he suddenly ordered his driver to find Harold's home address and take him there immediately, leaving staff wondering why the board chairman would personally seek out an elderly janitor. And in the back seat of his car, Victor Wentworth clenched the photograph he had secretly taken from the security file, staring at the image of Harold and the younger man, his own unmistakable face from decades earlier, whispering in a tone that cracked with decades of regret, "I'm sorry, Father. I should have never let him treat you like this." Harold lived in a tiny apartment on the city's outskirts, a quiet life built from years of heartbreak, because decades earlier he had owned a small watch repair shop where he raised his only son, Victor, alone after his wife passed, teaching him about patience, honesty, and the priceless value of time. Not in the form of expensive watches, but in the form of moments, memories, and good character. But when Victor became ambitious and rose through the world of corporate finance, he gradually distanced himself from the modest life his father represented, ashamed of the humble roots that had shaped him. And after a bitter argument years earlier, they drifted apart until silence replaced family. Still, Harold followed his son's career from afar, watching with pride but never intruding, supporting him quietly by working long hours as a janitor even in old age so he wouldn't burden him. And when the knock came on his door, Harold opened it to find his son, now one of the most powerful men in the country, standing there with tears in his eyes, calling him Dad for the first time in years, apologizing for every mistake, every absence, every failure as a son, and Harold, despite the pain, welcomed him in with a soft, forgiving smile, because a father's heart always finds room to heal. Yet, as they sat together, Victor clenched his fist and vowed that no one, especially not the arrogant CEO who had disgraced him, would get away with humiliating his father again, setting in motion a plan that would shake the entire corporation to its core. The following morning, a summons was sent to every board member, senior executive, and department head for an emergency meeting, plunging the company into a state of confusion as employees whispered and speculated about what crisis could be significant enough to call such a sudden gathering. And when Daniel walked into the boardroom, unfazed and self-assured, he didn't expect to find the chairman seated with a cold, burning expression of controlled fury. Unaware of the storm brewing, he launched into a speech about intensifying security protocols and removing untrustworthy employees, making himself sound like a guardian of corporate integrity. But Victor slammed a file on the table, security footage, witness statements, and a signed report declaring that no evidence linked Harold to the missing watch, forcing the CEO to sit down in stunned silence as the chairman's voice thundered that his actions were unprofessional, unethical, and downright cruel. And when Daniel tried to defend himself, claiming he had the right to suspect the help, Victor stood up and revealed the truth that dropped the room into breathless silence. The man you humiliated, the man you called a thief, is my father.